Good morning, everyone. Before I begin, I would like to say a brief word of thanks. It is a true honor to be speaking here today at the Urban Creativity Conference, and I would especially like to thank Pedro Soares Neves for his tireless work organizing this event and for so carefully managing the technology that a hybrid conference always makes that little bit more complicated. So thank you, Pedro, and thank you all for having me. A few moments ago, I played you a fragment of a piece by Jacob van Eyck, the remarkable 17th century musician who performed in the streets of Utrecht, the Netherlands. It seemed an appropriate way to begin this presentation, because my research is also concerned with art that belongs to the street. Not art enclosed within museum walls, nor poetry confined to books, but literature that lives among cyclists, canal water, brick facades, cafes, church bells, and hurried footsteps. Imagine walking through a city where poems do not simply decorate walls, they answer one another. A medieval text is answered by an anonymous haiku, and a commissioned poem invites an unofficial response. Thus, the city itself begins to read and rewrite its own literary history. Today, I would like to invite you to take that walk with me. Some of you may already know Utrecht for its medieval center, its canals, its famous Dom Tower, and more recently, it has also become recognized as a UNESCO City of Literature, celebrating literature not merely as something preserved in libraries, but as something woven into everyday urban life. Throughout the city, poetry appears in unexpected places. Poems are engraved into pavements, painted onto walls, displayed in public squares, and integrated into the architecture itself. Literature is not encountered only by those actively seeking it. Instead, it accompanies ordinary routines, walking to work, cycling home, crossing a bridge, and waiting for a train. Simple observation fascinated me. What happens when literature leaves the page and enters public space? And perhaps an even more intriguing question followed. What happens when members of the public begin answering it? When we think of street art, I think we usually imagine images before words. Graffiti, murals, stencils, stickers, paste-ups. Street art scholarship has understandably devoted much attention to visual expressions. Yet cities also contain another, quieter form of intervention, poetry. Some poems are officially commissioned, some have become recognized landmarks within the city's literary identity, and others appear anonymously, small, temporary. Sometimes nothing more than 3 carefully chosen lines. These anonymous interventions often respond directly to poems already present in the city. Rather than occupying empty walls, they enter into dialogue with existing literary works. And in doing so, they transform public space into something rather remarkable. It's not a gallery, it's not an archive, it's an ongoing conversation. The city becomes less like a museum, preserving finished works, and more like a manuscript whose margins remain open for new voices. The focus of my research that I will be presenting today is one such anonymous collective known as Straat Haiku, Street Haiku. For approximately 1 year, the collective placed handwritten haiku throughout Utrecht, often in direct conversation with existing poems or literary references. Their interventions were deliberately modest. They were not monumental murals designed to dominate the urban landscape. They were quiet gestures, easily overlooked and often removed within days. This ephemerality is important. Their work resists permanence. It also resists conventional notions of artistic authority. The poems are unsigned. The authors remain anonymous. And their interventions exist outside literary institutions, outside publishing houses, outside museums. And yet, they participate in one of literature's oldest traditions, responding to earlier texts. I had the opportunity to speak to some members of the collective, allowing me not only to document her work, but also to understand the intentions behind it. What emerged was not a desire to challenge literature itself, but rather to participate in it. And this distinction, I believe, is crucial. Their materials, too, were carefully chosen. Many of the haiku were written in chalk, sometimes accompanied by small stickers placed nearby. Chalk carries a particular significance here. It washes away in the rain. This impermanence resonates with an aesthetic sensibility close to the Japanese notion of wabi-sabi, beauty found precisely in transience and imperfection. But there's also a more practical dimension. Because chalk is so strongly associated with children's play, it rarely invites accusations of vandalism. No one is fined for a hopscotch grid. In this sense, the choice of chalk is not only poetic, but also quite strategic. It allows the collective to intervene in public space without any legal consequence. And this precisely is the conversation that forms the heart of my paper. Allow me to pause our walk for a moment. At first sight, these anonymous haiku may seem insignificant. They are temporary, they disappear, they leave no permanent monuments behind. But must cultural significance always depend upon permanence? The classical canon often assumes that important works endure. They are preserved, catalogued, and protected. They enter libraries, museums, and anthologies. Street poetry proposes a rather different understanding of culture. Its value lies not in permanence, but in encounter. A poem appears. Someone notices it. Someone smiles. Someone photographs it. Someone reflects upon it. Eventually, the rain washes it away. Its material existence is brief, yet its cultural life may continue through memory, conversation, photographs, and now academic research. Rather than imagining literature as a collection of finished objects, these interventions invite us to understand literature as a continuing social practice. The city is no longer simply displaying poems. It is participating in poetry. Let me give you an example. One of Utrecht's official poems occupies a respected place within the city's literary landscape. It speaks with the confidence we often associate with published literature, authorized, carefully positioned, institutionally recognized. Nearby, however, someone placed a small handwritten haiku. The response does not vandalize the original, nor does it attempt to replace it. Instead, it does something much more interesting. It answers. Like any good conversation, it neither repeats nor rejects what came before it. It extends it. The meaning of the original poem begins to shift, not because its words have changed, but because another voice has entered the conversation. This reminds us that interpretation is never a solitary act. Every reading carries within the possibility of a response. The anonymous poet simply makes that response visible. Interestingly, this was not an isolated case. A haiku placed near a well-known bookshop closely echoes another haiku that had, until recently, been attached to a temporary object directly beneath the Dom Tower. The two poems are almost identical, differing only in small details. This repetition is telling, for it suggests that the collective does not simply respond once and move on. Certain phrases, images, or ideas circulate and return, appearing in different parts of the city in slightly altered form. The city, in other words, does not only contain isolated replies, it contains echoes. Perhaps the most striking example concerns the famous medieval phrase Hebben Ola Vogala. For Dutch audiences, these words occupy an almost mythical position. They are frequently presented as the earliest surviving example of written Dutch, and therefore hold an important place within the national literary imagination. Canonized texts often acquire a certain stillness. We admire them, we preserve them, and sometimes we even become reluctant to speak back to them. But the anonymous haiku refuses this silence. Rather than treating the medieval fragment as an untouchable monument, it treats it as something still capable of conversation. I found this profoundly significant, for this intervention does not diminish the historical importance of the original, it does quite the opposite. It demonstrates that the text remains culturally alive, precisely because contemporary readers continue engaging with it. Perhaps this is one way in which the literary canon survives, not by remaining unchanged, but by remaining answerable. My final example is lighter in tone, yet equally revealing. Here the anonymous poet responds to a poem about a mermaid by introducing contemporary references, playful language, and gentle humor. Medieval imagery encounters smartphones. Ancient symbolism meets modern dating cultures, and high literature meets everyday life. The result is not a mockery, nor is it irreverence. It is affection. And this is one of the reasons I begin thinking about fan studies while conducting this research. Fans rarely seek to destroy the works they love. Instead, they revisit them, they reinterpret them, they place them into new context, and they ask them new questions. In much the same way, these anonymous poets approach the literary landscape of Utrecht, not as passive readers, but as active participants. They accept an invitation extended by the city itself, and by writing back, they remind us that literature had perhaps never been a monologue. It has always been a conversation across generations. And the streets of Utrecht simply allow us to watch that conversation unfold in public. The three examples I have just shown are, of course, individual encounters, yet together they began to suggest a broader pattern. I found myself searching for a language capable of describing what I was witnessing. What exactly happens when readers begin responding to literature in public space? How should we understand these anonymous conversations between canonical texts and contemporary voices? It was these observations that led me back to theory. Not because theory produced the answers, but because it offered the vocabulary through which those answers could begin to emerge. Henry Jenkins famously argued that audiences no longer merely consume culture. They participate in its creation, extending narratives, producing new interpretations, and contributing their own creative responses. His work emerged largely from studies of fan communities and digital media, where readers and viewers become active participants rather than passive consumers. Walking through Utrecht, I found myself wondering whether the same process might also occur in physical space. Could the city itself become a participatory medium? Could the wall poem function rather like a piece of fan fiction, inviting readers not only to interpret it, but also to answer it? This led me to the concept that I propose today, urban literary fan practice. By this, I mean a form of cultural participation, in which readers of the urban literary landscape actively rewrite, extend, and reinterpret the texts they encounter within the city. The anonymous poets of Straat Haiku are not simply writing poetry. They are reading, publicly, and they are making that reading visible. At the same time, Donna Haraway reminds us that changing the stories by which we live can change the worlds we inhabit. Her invitation is not merely to invent new stories, but also to recognize that narratives remain open to revision, reinterpretation, and conversation. In Utrecht, these conversations take place not only in books or classrooms, but on brick walls, besides canals. This brings me to the central question of today. What does it mean to update a canon? Traditionally, canons have often been imagined as stable collections of authoritative works. They preserve memory, they establish continuity, and they offer common cultural reference points. Yet, they've also been criticized for excluding voices, privileging institutions, and presenting literary history as something largely complete. They were not attempting to replace the literary canon, they were writing themselves into an ongoing conversation with it. The anonymous street haiku I've discussed today suggests a rather different image. Here, the canon is not replaced, nor is it dismantled. Instead, it is entered. Readers become participants. Participation becomes dialogue. Dialogue becomes part of literary history itself. The authority of the original text remains, but no longer speaks alone. Perhaps this is the deepest contribution that street poetry makes to discussions of canon formation. It reminds us that cultural heritage is not only something we inherit, it is also something we continue. Allow me to conclude by returning to the three contributions that I hope this research can make. First, I suggest that street poetry deserves greater attention within street art studies. If we understand street art primarily through images, we overlook an entire landscape of textual interventions that quietly reshape the experience of urban spaces. Second, I propose the concept of urban literary fan practice as a way of understanding how readers become participants within the literary landscape of the city. Rather than treating canonical texts as finished monuments, urban literary fan practice recognizes that readers actively extend, reinterpret, and answer the stories they encounter in public space. Finally, I argue that anonymous street poetry invites us to rethink literary authority itself. The significance of these poems lies not in their permanence. Most of them disappear. The significance lies in demonstrating that literature remains alive whenever someone feels entitled not only to read it, but to answer it. Perhaps authorship is less about speaking first than about a conversation alive. I would like to finish where we began. At the start of this presentation, we listened briefly to the music of Jacob van Eyck, who filled the street of Utrecht with sound nearly 4 centuries ago. Today, those same streets are still alive with artistic voices. Some are official, some are anonymous, some carefully preserved, and others destined to disappear after a few days. Yet together they remind us that culture has never been a finished monument. It's a conversation. When we encounter an anonymous haiku besides an official poem, we witness something quietly extraordinary. Not a rejection of tradition, not the destruction of the canon, but its continuation. Perhaps the true measure of literary canon is not how faithfully it is preserved, but whether it continues to invite participation. If so, then what I have called urban literary fan practice is not an exception to literary culture. It is one of the ways in which literary culture remains alive. Perhaps the most generous canon is one that leaves space in its margins for another hand to write. Thank you.